Welcome to Don't Chuck It Up, the podcast where we help students and families navigate the wild journey of the college search and applying to colleges without breaking a sweat. I'm your host, Chuck, and today we are talking with my good friend, Tej Mattil. Tej, welcome to the Don't Chuck It Up podcast.
Chuck, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm just super excited that you're here because I was hoping that you would sign up to be a guest because I think you and I have a lot to talk about. We're going to try and keep this to a relatively short episode. However, I know we could probably talk for a few hours. So before we get started, Tej, why don't you help my listeners understand a little bit who you are and kind of what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chuck and I worked together way back in the day at Lawrence University when I first started in admissions. You know what, the year is irrelevant, a long time ago. Since then, I've gone on, I was a director of admissions, a dean, a vice president of enrollment, etc. So at a few different small liberal arts institutions throughout largely Wisconsin, but also a short stint in Indiana. Before doing what I do now, which is, a couple different things. Most relevant here is I was the founding director of Leading Colleges, a consortium of small liberal arts institutions working together to get the word out on being a student-centered college and university. So that's the work I do here for this conversation, which I'm really excited about. I do a series of presentations in my local community, similar focus as this podcast, right? Trying to help students be less stressed, less concerned. I wouldn't say without breaking a sweat. That's a bold promise for this podcast, but I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I really like your group of leading colleges, and I really encourage families to go Google and check that out. It's a great way to learn about small liberal arts colleges, mostly, that are really not very well known, but do an incredible job helping students grow and become incredible adults by going to college. Because as you well know, too many families focus on the colleges that they've heard of, that are readily known, that are very, very popular. And your organization really highlights those schools that are the hidden gems in the United States and really places that can take a student from not being confident in who they are to being an incredible adult and being prepared for the work world.
Yeah, indeed, you've got it. And Chuck, this is why I'm so excited for this conversation, right? That everything you just said, students focus at the start on the colleges they've heard of, so oftentimes parents do as well. And it leads to students entering the college search process with their families, I think, way too stressed about things they do not need to be stressed out about, and way too relaxed about things that they really need to stress out about, right? I think the priorities are all out of whack, and I think we can be helpful today.
Yeah, so Tej and I want to talk with everyone about how do you build a good college list, and also keep in mind, how can you make an affordable college list? Because as my listeners know, I really try and help students, families come up with colleges that fit students academically, socially, and for parents financially, because I don't want students or families to stress out about all of those things. And again, as Tej said, we often stress about the stuff that we shouldn't, and we're not stressing enough about the stuff that we should. So let's talk about, how do you help families think about building a college list and think about affordability?
Yeah, that's great. And it's the two things right at the outset that I think where families are putting too much emphasis is, am I going to get into a good college? Yes, you are. Now let's figure out which ones. Okay. And then, can I afford it? And they look at the sticker price and they stress out about the sticker price. And and any of your listeners know, the sticker price is going to change. I always say, never eliminate a college based on the tuition price you see on the website, but definitely eliminate a college based on your actual price, right? Like that's where the line comes in. And if I can I just tell you a short story about the first college road trip I gave?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So picture it. The year was 2018. It was December. It was very snowy that year. And I got a call from my little sister. Okay. And she had a high school sophomore at the time, and she said, "Hey, Tej," she started very aggressive, Chuck, very aggressive. She said, "Hey, Tej, do you remember when Haley, my niece, when Haley was in 6th grade?" And then she stopped, and I was like, "Sure, I think so, yeah." And she said, "Well, when Haley was in 6th grade, you told her that when she was older, you would take her to visit colleges. Do you remember that? Which I did not, but it sounds like something I would say, right? And I'm sure I meant like, oh, we'll go look at some, maybe Bradley down in Chicago or something.
Exactly.
Maybe Iowa if we're getting wild. And my sister says, well, you did. You told her that and she remembers. And I was like, okay. And then my sister says, well, are you going to do it? Or are you going to let her down so she knows what to expect from men in her life?
Oh, geez.
Okay, I don't like nuclear. And I was like, oh my gosh, right? Like, okay. So I didn't quite know what that was about yet, but I was like, yes. Oh, wow. Don't put that on me, right? Like, let that be her.
Yeah, no pressure. No pressure.
Yeah. So I learned, and she said, good, because Haley, she really wants to go to Boise State University, and we don't want to take her. And I was like, did you just emotionally manipulate me to a road trip from Milwaukee to Boise? And she was like, yeah. And Haley's here. She heard you say yes. So that was it. So that's how I got, Chuck, my first college road trip. And my niece, Haley, is academically very gifted and high achieving. And I know those two don't always go hand in hand, but for her, they did. She was always finding it out for valedictorian at a school where everybody doesn't get a 4.0. All right. That's important to know. And she took her school seriously. She was a soccer player, made the varsity team finally her junior year. And I was like, this is not the profile of a D1 soccer player. Okay.
Right.
But I couldn't tell Haley that. She wouldn't accept it from me.
Yep.
And I knew she needed to be at a small school, not a big school. But again, she needed to learn that. So I agreed. And this is where the advice comes into families, right? When you're first starting to build a list. Haley had a starting assumption, big school soccer. Okay. So Boise State University, Chuck, it was no more than she liked the blue field. That was it.
And that's probably what she knew about Boise State heading out there was, they have that really cool blue field. And I want to put on that. Yep.
So I agreed to take her to Boise under the condition that also I was going to get to show her other colleges. And I knew she needed a small liberal arts institution. I just needed her to feel that for herself. So I took over the week. We went to Boise State University. We went to Fort Collins, Colorado. We went to Rocky Mountain College in Montana, which she loved. She hated Boise. Should we be identifying these institutions by name?
It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, you know what, Boise State, come for us. But anyway, she didn't like Boise State. Her cousin loved it. Her cousin absolutely adored Boise State. Haley, it wasn't for her. And I knew that. And she loved Rocky Mountain. And I think she would have gone there if they had her major. They didn't. And she ended up changing her whole list, her whole approach. She ended up at Clark University in Dubuque, Iowa. She's had a great experience. So happy. But it started because I took her starting position of Boise State or other D1, and I exposed her to other institutions, and she could see herself elsewhere. And so that's the advice I always give families. To get back to your question, Chuck, when you say, take a day, maybe two, find the colleges near you, right? And visit a large school, a small school, a medium school, a private school, a public school. It doesn't even matter if they have their major or if you would want to go that close to home. It just is get the students in different types of environments and find out what they like and don't like about those environments. Again, even if the school isn't right for them.
Right. And I equate this to when families are, shopping for a new home or a new place to live. You oftentimes are going to tour things that are not in the right neighborhood or not maybe the perfect right size or the right vibe, but you're going to see what features you like, what things you enjoy about a particular home or apartment. And then you take that knowledge and you go, oh, now that I've seen that in person, I don't think I, need an outdoor patio that I thought I might like. Maybe I want something different. So now you take that off your list and maybe you add something else because you saw something in a house and you went, oh, that's great. Same thing with colleges. I think a lot of families, though, go, we have to jump on a plane and fly far away and do our first college search. And I agree with you. Staying closer to home is obviously cheaper. You don't have to spend all the time, money, and energy traveling to another part of the country. And two, we're seeing a lot more students opt to go to college a bit closer to home. I don't know if that's post-COVID or just the way the vibe of this generation is, but start close to home because then you can do those searches when you have those days off. I tell parents often, look at the academic calendar and find when the student has a day or two off from school and
Mhm.
the colleges are offering tours. So, like, don't go on Thanksgiving Day because no one's going to be there and it's going to be cold, dark, and dreary probably. So, find a day that works best for the student and the parent to go visit some local colleges and be daring to tour a college that you had never heard of that's close to home. So here in Wisconsin, oftentimes students do go to UW-Madison, but then I say, well, did you go visit Edgewood or did you go visit Madison College or,
Mhm.
UW-Whitewater or even Beloit, which is not that far away. So, but they go, well, I've never heard of those. They might not be good. So how do you
Yeah.
deal with families and students when they come with that reaction of, I haven't heard of that school, therefore it must not be good?
Well, I mean, Chuck, you and I have been dealing with that in our career, our whole time, our whole time in
Mhm.
admissions, right? The idea of if it's a good college, they surely have made the NCAA Sweet 16, if not the Final Four. Um, and I think to me, it's a little bit of recentering as far as uh, how are you defining good? And if you're defining it as has everybody heard of it? Okay, sure, right? Like then the colleges I've worked at might not have made your list. But if you're defining it correctly, which I would say as a good match for you and between the school and the student, then you're going to see that it doesn't need to be something you've heard of necessarily for it to be a good match for you, right? Um, I think families intuitively do get the concept of it's about finding a match as opposed to like getting the name brand um
I hope so, but I
sweatshirt.
think that's a hard part. That's sometimes a hard pill to swallow for some parents.
Yes, well, they don't start there, and I think that's the key, right? And you're right. So for some parents, for some students, right, we've seen that where they just aren't going to be moved from that, and that's a uh different type of college search. I tend to, maybe it's the vibes I put off, right? I don't tend to get too involved with families that are searching for like the biggest name brand college. Sure, go ahead and spend all of your energy, um, and 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 to be frank, money trying to get into Yale and Harvard.
Right,
I get that.
right.
Um, but for me, where I think I'm most helpful for students and families is when we're really kind of exploring their interests, their criteria, and finding colleges maybe that they've not heard of that are a good match for them.
And I think you brought up some other good points with your niece is that she was planning to go one direction, but then once she started to see some spaces and places, she
Mhm.
promptly switched her mindset. And I'm sure that also thought about like what academic program she was first thinking of. That probably shifted as well. So
Yep.
how did you also talk about the conversation of cost?
Yeah.
Because that is a factor that I think what you were alluding to earlier, something that parents think about too late in the process. And no one walks into a car dealership and says, no, I'm just going to start with road tripping with a Ferrari and see if it fits me, and then I'll figure out how to pay
Mhm.
for it later. Like, but why are we doing that with colleges and saying, oh, I'm going to start with the most expensive thing, or I'm going to avoid the most expensive thing because there's no way that I could ever possibly afford it? So how do you bring up cost with students and families?
Yep. Yeah. The advice I give is always, no matter what stage of the college search process you're in right now, whether your kid is finalizing their set of colleges they've been admitted to, or they're just starting to think about the PSAT as a sophomore, right? Wherever you are, if you have not talked with your child about financial resources for college, do it now as soon as possible. And here's what I mean. There's no other major purchase that we as parents would say to a 17-year-old, honey, wherever you want to go, we'll make it work, right? We would not say that about your senior year spring break. We would
Right.
not say that about the car that they're going to buy to get to and from their high school
Absolutely.
job, right? We would never say, go to the car dealership and just whatever feels right to you. Do you know what I mean? But for some reason, and I think it has to do with college as part of the American dream, but for whatever reason, we as parents feel the need to say that about college, that if there's financial limitations on where they're going to go for college, that we've somehow let them down. And it's just not the case. So uh, I think we first have to get comfortable as parents with that idea. And then we need to let our kids know what the limitations are and are not. Whatever funds are available for college, whether there's a savings account or not, whether there's going to be resources made available or not. The students need to know that so they can factor it in. We can't expect students to make an informed decision, factoring in the cost of college, if parents don't give them any guidelines,
Right.
what's going to be available. And so often, and you've seen this, I'm sure, Chuck, right? We've talked about it as we were working at colleges in financial aid season, where the parents are just white knuckling it through aid season, hoping against hope that it all comes together. And students, if they've not been factoring in finances in their application set, don't know any better and are falling in love with colleges that may not be financially viable for them.
And I've unfortunately have had to deal with that situation more often than not. And it's usually, well, it's never been my actual students or clients. It's usually families that call me in April and they say, hey, my kid got admitted to XYZ school, but there's no way that we can afford it. And I look and truly what this is a scenario is it's not low income families. It's not really high income families. It's that medium income family that's trying to make things work. And could they afford it? Sure, but they would literally be eating ramen noodles every night for the next 4 years. Or they come up with this notion of, well, we'll just take out a bunch of loans. And I have to remind families that it is possible, but you're going to be doing a second mortgage on your house, or you're doing, a home equity loan. And do you really want to go down that road? Because that is going to impact you for the rest of your life. Where there are loans available through the Stafford Loan Program that are fairly reasonable for students to take, but you don't have to in order to go to college. It's not a requirement. It can help, but I don't want families to be like, oh yeah, we'll just figure out a way to. I have more families or not say that. We'll just figure out how to pay for it later. And I'm just going, you wouldn't do that in any other shopping experience. To your point, why are you doing it with something that could potentially cost you, $400,000 over the course of 4 years if you're going for the really high expensive colleges? So any other tips that you would give a family when they're struggling with this idea of cost, what was affordable?
Well, here's what I say. For a long time, I've advised students, never apply to a single college you would not love to go to, right? Because it does no good to get admitted to a college that you're going to hate going to, okay? So I have since revised to say also never apply to a college you're not going to be able to afford to go to. And that's tricky because the financial aid packages don't come out until much later.
Right.
However, what we can do right now is utilize net price calculators. And when I do presentations on how to figure out college, this is something I advise families to do. Get to the FAFSA estimator website, figure out what your student aid index is going to be. That takes about 10, 15 minutes. And then as your student is finding colleges they're interested in, either they can do it or you can do it. Go to the net price calculator, get a general sense of what that college would cost you, and then use that to rule things in or out. Of course, the net price calculators are still rough estimates, right? They're still kind of ballparks, but they give you a sense of inbounds, out of bounds. Doesn't solve the problem of cost, but it helps you see if this is a school you're interested in and the aid package is not going to be possible, move on and keep looking for the next one.
So let's talk about some vocabulary that you threw out there that families
I'm sorry, yes, thank you.
What the heck is he talking about? So net price calculator, also known as the NPC.
Nobody knows it that way, Chuck. Nobody calls it. But I'm kidding. Go ahead.
On the websites like that, and you're like, oh, just fill out our NPC. And it's like, what is an NPC? A net price calculator. What families probably do not know is that every four-year college in the United States is required to have a net price calculator somewhere on their website. Now, it is not going to be on the front page with a big shiny button that says net price calculator, please click here. You may have to search the website to find it. So what does a net price calculator do? Why should a family be filling this out?
Yes. Well, and that's a great question. And you're right. I did just skip right over that. So a net price calculator, what you do, you can enter your student's academic information, your family's financial information. You do not have to provide any personal identifying information. They will ask it. It must be optional, right? So you don't have to tell them who you are or why you're asking, or to be frank, if you're redoing it to see how things change if your student increases their test score, okay? You enter that information and it gives you an estimate. The shorthand way is if this student were to have been admitted this year or last year, depending on when it was updated, here's roughly what the financial aid package would have looked like. So again, institutional priorities can shift year to year, right? So it's not an absolute like planning document, but it is enough to tell you inbounds, out of bounds, a financial stretch school, a financial reach school, etc.
And I've had a couple of families fill that out and be shocked in a positive way
Mhm.
at what their student may receive, because it will estimate potential scholarships that the student could qualify
Mhm.
for. Again, it is an estimate, it is not a guarantee. And then it
Mhm.
will also go through the need-based process and figure out, okay, this is how much your family is able to afford, and this is what type of financial aid package we would provide to you if you had applied either, as you said, this year or last year. The net price calculators are updated once a year. We just don't know when they're updated, if they're using this year's information or last year's information. And I have also had families adjust some of the numbers. They may put in a different test score, or if it's a younger
Yeah.
student in the family, they may put a different GPA and say, okay, if our kid gets a 3.0, what is it? If it's a 3.5, what do they get? That type of information.
Mhm.
And families have been really pleasantly surprised. They've also come back shocked at some of the colleges that they thought through media that they were going to possibly get more money, and then they
Mhm.
realized, oh, we don't fall into the category of getting more money. We thought any family that would apply to this school would get money, and it's like, no, only certain categories. So yeah, that's
Yep.
really helpful. So
Yeah.
if they don't want to go through the net price calculator and they want to have a better sense as to how much they can afford, you mentioned the FAFSA and the student aid
Uh,
index. So what is that all about?
sure. So of course, the student aid index is if you're a family who's gone through this a few years ago with a different student, you might remember the EFC, the expected family contribution. The student aid index is just the federal government's calculation as a starting point for colleges to determine financial aid eligibility. Um, it's not quite meant to be here's how much this family can pay, although it is often shorthanded that way. But instead, it's a numeric value that colleges use to start to allot financial aid. The federal government uses it for some of their aid programs as well,
Mhm.
but that's going to be the outcome of the FAFSA when you apply for financial aid in the fall, hopefully in future years, but certainly winter this year,
Yep.
student senior year. It's going to produce a student aid index, which will get sent to colleges and universities, and that's how they start to calculate financial aid. So if you can do the student aid index and then go do a couple net price calculators, you will have the best chance you have right now of getting a realistic cost estimate for the colleges you're considering.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah.
Another thing that families will bring up is that, their student has a goal of going to graduate school. Maybe it's
Yeah.
to med school or law school, or they're thinking of doing a PhD or even an MBA. Where should those factors of costs and fit fall into the undergraduate search? So,
Mhm.
you think
Mhm.
families should go to a really expensive undergrad to prepare them for graduate school, or should they more go to a affordable undergrad and then think about graduate school? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, I don't think any family should put themselves in a situation where their student is at an unaffordable school for them, right? Like, of course, there are exceptions. There may be very valid reasons to take out large amounts of student loan debt, um, but I would advocate strongly to keep looking for other options when possible. So that's my first answer. But whether it's graduate school, which was the case for my niece, right? She was planning to go into physical therapy, which was going to require
Yep.
graduate school. Um, that was part of the calculation. And Chuck, I know from one of your previous podcasts, I think the one about rejection, where you said, yeah, that was the one where you said you could go to grad school for that institution as well. That
Mhm.
could be part of the calculus, right? So in my niece's story, maybe she really had an attachment to Boise. Maybe that would have been a graduate school option for her, right? Things like that can come into play. But ultimately, the question that I raise for students and families is kind of what's the student's goal? Why does the student want to go to college? And that can start to highlight how these decision points could come together.
Hmm.
If the student's goal is an alumni network, right? Well, then you can tap into that school's alumni network as a graduate alumni or an undergraduate alumni, right? If it's the experience that, like, I just want to be at a really cool environment, well, that explains, or that helps elucidate what type of college we should be looking for. And if it's our favorite types of students, Chuck, students that want to go to college because of a love of learning, right? They want to just get in there and kind
Yep.
of engage with the great books and the original, some of the original kind of philosophical underpinnings of our society. That's a different search altogether. I'm sorry, I think I wandered away from your question,
No,
which you knew I was going to do when you invited me here. So,
I think it's something to consider for parents is that if you are thinking that your student is going to go off to graduate school, maybe going to a more affordable undergrad might set them up better for financial stability when going to graduate school, because there are some schools that offer lots of scholarships and aid to their grad students, and there's some that, med school very rarely, sometimes would provide some type of support. So you're going to be taking on a lot of debt, and maybe that might be something that you save in your undergrad to be able to afford more for graduate school. Um, had a couple other questions I would love to know. So, for those of you listening, Teach has been a director of admissions, a dean of admissions, and a VP of enrollment. So, his job is to oversee a lot of admission staff and review a lot of applications. So, both Teach and I have reviewed probably tens of thousands of Common Apps over the year. I don't even want to think about that number, how many Common Apps we've looked at in our lifetime.
don't think about it, Chuck.
I know. I would love, is there anything that you would, as a former dean and VP, is there anything that you would give advice to students who are, possibly going to send their applications and have them be reviewed by a dean or VP? Is there anything that you would say to them? Like, I'm just curious from that hat that you formerly worn.
Sure, sure. Well, and Chuck, the institutions I've been at, most of them were not particularly selective, right? Um,
Right.
so for many of the institutions, it was much more about test score and GPA and kind of moving on from there. And the issues of institutional fit were much more likely to come up at the margin, students who weren't clearly admissible or deniable. However, I have worked at a couple institutions that were selective, and you know those as well. And in those cases, we were really trying to get a sense of who is this student genuinely and where are they going to fit in on our campus. The advice I give to students is to make sure your application is genuinely you. And the reason I say that is if you're kind of presenting yourself to us in a way that you think we want, we can see through that, but then we don't know who you are, right? Like, we can see what you're trying to do, but we don't know what you're really bringing to the campus community. And so we're left with kind of a blank slate. Additionally, if you have a hiccup on your transcript, we do see it, we do notice it, and you should explain it to us, right? Don't let it be up to our imagination what happened your sophomore year that kind of brought your grades down second semester.
I think that's amazing advice, and I'm really appreciative to hear that from you, who has reviewed applications at a very high level, at the dean and the VP level, to say, yeah, we just want to know who the student is and make sure that they are a great fit for our institution, and stop trying to fake who you are. They shouldn't be adding 20 different activities their senior year because they think colleges are going to want to see that. I always tell students, get involved and just stick to who you are and be who you are. This is going off to college is probably the first time in your life that you get to truly represent who you are and what your goals and aspirations are, and be it, do it, and the colleges will love you for being that authentic individual. Uh, I would love to pivot in a different direction. So, how did you get to where you are? So, take me back to high school, Tej. What type of high school did you go to? You don't have to name it if you don't want. But what type of high school did you go to? And then what was your educational path?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, it was a large public school, about 350 students in my graduating class. Not a college going culture, I'll say it that way. It was a small number of students from my graduating class that percentage wise ended up earning a a bachelor's degree.
Hmm.
And I found my college. I went to the University of Wisconsin Whitewater, and I loved it. I had a great experience there. I then promptly went on to work at institutions nothing like Whitewater, right? But I loved Whitewater for me. Um, and uh, I started going to some of the college visits when they would come by. UW Whitewater came by and UW Parkside. Those were my top two colleges once I was applying. And I'll never forget Chuck, the guidance. It was guidance at the time. The guidance secretary said to me during one of the visits, she said, "Teach, are you really thinking about college, or are you just trying to get out of class?" Which should tell you, like, they didn't have me tracked for
Oh boy.
um now in her defense, I was just trying to get out of class. She clocked me correctly. um but it was those visits, and I remember at the time, Chuck, and you might remember this, they came around with a big like plastic presentation board that they would open up
Oh
with
yeah.
actual photographs of the college right
Oh
on there.
man.
Yep, telling the story. But I ended up at Whitewater because I knew I wanted to major in accounting. Ended up majoring in women's studies. I knew I wanted to stay close to home. Whitewater was about 45 minutes away, and my best friend was going to Whitewater, so that was it for me. And I ended up at Whitewater for undergrad and graduate school, and then found my way up to Lawrence in admissions after that.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you probably were not a 4.0 perfect ACT kid in high school.
No, I did do really well on the ACT. Um, there's a story behind that, Chuck, for off podcast I can tell you about.
Oh,
But I did really well on the ACT, which I think is what pulled me through that particular admissions process relative to my GPA, which was,
yeah,
there's two types of mismatches, right? Where the GPA is really strong, but the test score is low, and then we could just assume they're not a good test taker. I was the opposite. My test score was much higher than my GPA would have led you to believe.
that probably was you didn't really care about high school, or you didn't really put any energy into high school, but you were really good at bubbling and you could figure out the game of the ACT, because that's really what it is it's a game of process of elimination, figuring out of those four answers. We already know that two were completely incorrect, and you're down to two that could plausibly be correct, and you were just a really good guesser. That's my estimate on it. But yeah, and that is one type of student, and the other type as well. As you know, I'm a huge advocate for test optional processes and test free processes, so that the ACT does not have to define you, but if it can help you, that also is great for some students as well. It can add some extra information for students who may not have, I don't know, given much of a care to their classes and were more interested in lunch hour or gym class than they were in going to their actual high school coursework.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I agree.
but I just wanted to show that, you could become a leader in a college admissions office, not having to go to an Ivy League school. Like there's this whole perception that deans and VPs are these old guys with gray hair. Now I'm the guy with the gray hair, but I've never been a dean or a VP. You aren't old or gray. So you somehow were managed to get into that role without fitting the stereotypes.
Well, I did have the bow tie, and there's box ties available to help with the gray. So
Teach was a bow tie type of guy, so that's made him very deanly when he was out there meeting with families and networking with other colleagues as well. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Teach. Is there any other advice that you would love to share with my listeners based off of your experience, both from inside the college world and now from outside of the college world as a consultant?
Yes, I would just reaffirm, talk internally about money now. Failing to do that until the end is one of the surest ways to chuck up this admissions process.
Ooh, nice. Thanks for the plug. Yeah, I really do want students and families to understand this process. It is muddy, it is confusing. I totally get that. There's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of deadlines, a lot of lingo you have to learn. Right now is the time we're recording this in late November. It is financial aid season for seniors who are heading off to college the next year. Get that stuff done. If you have questions, reach out to myself or your school counselor, or reach out to the colleges directly. They know that the financial aid process is confusing. So if you have questions, reach out to your admissions officer or reach out to the financial aid office at the colleges where you've applied and ask your questions. They probably are legitimate questions. I have a lot of families that say, oh, I should know this. Oh, this probably is the dumb question. No, you're probably going through it the first time, and it's probably a really good question that you need the answer to. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Tej. I always appreciate chatting with you. You always have great insights into this stuff.
I hope I didn't chuck it up.
Nope, you were extremely helpful, and I'm sure my listeners will appreciate all of your insights. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today, but fear not, we'll be back next week with more tips and tricks to help you conquer the college application process like a boss. Until then, remember, don't chuck it up.